Hello, and welcome to this week's episode of GIANT's Healthy Innovators Live TV. My name is Barry Shrier, and I'm your host. I'm the founder of GIANT Health. And as you know, every week we bring to you an episode of incredibly interesting, talented, and successful people who are at the forefront of delivering improved health outcomes by driving innovation in healthcare and helping to support the adoption of new technologies and other innovations in healthcare. So, Giant Health is a global community. We're nearly 200,000 people. Our strapline is that we serve everybody whose business is healthcare, technology, and innovation. We'd like to thank our sponsors, R2G, which is Research to Guidance. Thank you very much, Ralf and Isabel. Great to have you guys on board, and we're grateful for your support and your involvement. Everybody can meet the team from R2G at the Giant Health event. The Giant Health event this year is 30th of November, 1st of December. According to the Financial Times newspaper, it's Europe's largest, most valuable annual healthcare innovation event. So we invite all of our listeners from around the world to go to our website, www.giant.health, to learn about the Giant Health event and to join us if you can, either in London on those days or the entire event is delivered virtually. So everybody from around the world can participate remotely on our virtual event platform. So we hope to meet you and hope to engage with you. So Ralf, hello, it's great to see you. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for introducing and for having us, Barry.
No, we love our partnership with R2G, and it's really important to have the curation of the digital track that you're running at the event this year. Of course, today we're talking about decentralized clinical trials. So Ralf, I'll hand over to you. We invite you to introduce yourself, of course, and to lead the discussion today with Adam and Isabel about this important and very interesting subject.
Yeah, thank you, Barry, again. And also thank you, Adam, for joining us and Isabel for supporting me in this call. This call is all about discussing how digital solution can support clinical trials. And we all learned about those massive clinical trials conducted during the pandemic or to test vaccinations. So there were massive and huge clinical trials being conducted throughout the entire world. And the question we started to get really drawn into is how could digital tools support those trials and make them more efficient, make them more cost efficient, faster, and in terms of quality better. So that was our initial interest in this market as a company which is concentrating on the digital health space since 2010 already. So we have seen a lot of tools, a lot of waves in that market, and we also caught an interest in this market because it's hyped, and we wanted to dig deeper and find out what is behind the scene. And I'm really glad that we have one representative from the companies which wants to make clinical trials more efficient, faster, wants to support recruitment of those thousands of patients in those clinical trials. I have Adam with me on this show. Adam is from Curebase. It's a US-based company, but maybe I'll let you explain a bit more what Curebase stands for and how you would normally support a clinical trial with your service offering.
Thanks so much, Ralf, and thanks to everybody for joining the discussion and for watching. Really excited to be here. So Curebase, we are a provider of both software and services to support decentralized clinical trials specifically. So our software has the components that you would need as a sponsor, as a CRO, as an investigator, as a patient, to interact remotely and collect data remotely as part of clinical trials. So this is, eConsent and ePro and all these, electronic tools that we've started to become more accustomed to, especially lately, as well as on the services side, recognizing that software alone isn't enough. Big thing we've learned at Curebase is, our research participants, our patients, they want human interaction. So we have coordinators on staff who actually interact directly with participants, who are there for them whenever they need them through the platform, as well as project management and data management, of course, are core to us being able to operate efficiently. So yeah, we try and bring these solutions to studies that otherwise, I think for a long time, many of us in the industry have known that leaning more into technology is something that we really needed to do.
Yes.
And the pandemic was certainly a catalyst for that. And we at Curebase are just, we feel very fortunate that, the company was founded in late 2017. So we were able to build out the platform and the infrastructure kind of just in time for when the pandemic hit, unfortunately, and we could really try and offer our services to help in that regard.
Okay, yeah, great. And have you been involved into clinical trials supporting vaccination?
So vaccines specifically, we have not yet. We've supported a lot in the COVID diagnostic space. Here in the States, we've done a lot with the nice thing about the decentralized model is you can often, you can bring it anywhere. So we can go into rural communities where there are testing facilities and test to make sure that we can get, the type of rapid antigen tests quickly to the market and make sure that they're effective. So we've done a number of those here in the States, working with local healthcare providers. And over time, I imagine, we didn't participate in those vaccine trials for COVID as part of Curebase, but this is the type of model that, and you'll see from any of these trials, they try to incorporate certain pieces of what we'd call the larger decentralized kind of paradigm, which really is a term that's used very broadly and often doesn't mean fully virtual. But we saw things like ECOA being used in these type of trials, and honestly, in retrospect, I think there's a lot more that could have been done with those type of trials. Take patients at home and make things more easier for the participants.
I agree. Yeah, and we have, and Isabel could elaborate a bit more on the research project which she headed over the last months. We saw mega trials, testing behavior from Facebook patients, and funneling that into some kind of digital tool, and getting the results out of it. Answering question is, do people behaved over Christmas according to the rules or not? For example. So did those rules really had an impact on how people behaved? So we have seen patient or trials with hundreds of thousands of patients using technology to conduct this trial. But Isabel, I mean, you have worked now on this topic for many months now, and I know that you also have a background in conducting clinical trials. Maybe you can, as an intro here to this conversation, you can let us know, what was this research project all about?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Ralf. So as Ralf mentioned, we became very interested in the clinical trial market when we first began thinking as a company about these COVID mega trials and the COVID vaccine trials. And from here, we really asked the question, how are digital solutions changing the landscape? So we began to identify what were the key trends in the market and who were the key market players as well, and exactly what kinds of services were they offering to sponsors to truly make the clinical trial process more efficient and less burdensome for patients. And then, of course, we've also taken a look at the market size, and we have projections as well about the overall penetration rate of these kinds of solutions. And we truly believe from our research that in the next 5 years, we're going to see that that a greater percentage of clinical trials are going to start using, at least in part, some kind of virtual technology.
Yeah, and it was a study, or it was a research project which had a lens on the US and the European market. And I know, Adam, that Curebase is focusing on the US market at the moment, but I guess you would also like to reach out to other countries and other regions, because some of the prerequisites of of companies supporting clinical trials is or are that they are truly global. Yeah. So if you, so starting from the US, I think that's definitely a good choice. But going over to Europe, potentially as a next step, I don't know if that is one of your plans. Where do you see are the main differences between the US market and your service offering and the acceptance of that and the European market?
Yeah, no, you've read our mind here, Ralf, because we are already starting to make to try and expand our footprint globally, and we're starting in the European market, really doing a lot of work there. We have our first key hire recently at the director level in Europe, in Spain, to try and help us to start figure how can we start. We are a company that wants to leverage technology, do things differently, but still do it in a conservative way and not necessarily, it's important. Unlike any other tech space, right? We can't move fast and break things. Like, we need to move at a reasonable pace and make sure that we have an understanding of the regulatory landscape within the countries. Certainly, I think to the point you're hitting on, Ralf, there's, even from the different countries in the EU, we recognize that there are different things around the use of ePro or eConsent. So we're kind of doing a gap analysis right now for ourselves to make sure that as we enter these new regions, and specifically the EU, as we're looking to in the coming months, that we have resources either on the ground or regulatory expertise to ensure that we comply with all relevant regulations. But that is definitely where we need to go. Yeah, as a small startup, we wanted to start in the US where we were primarily based, but recognizing that large vaccine trials or drug studies, these are global studies, right? We need to be able to operate in the global environment, and we're trying to move quickly to gain the expertise internally or to work with consultants and others to ensure that we can meet our clients where they'd like to be in these many different regions.
Yeah, I mean, good luck with that. Coming to Europe, I know that from the discussions we had with companies like yours, they started to wonder why the European landscape is so different going from one country to the other. Yeah, but still knowing that, for example, EMA is now working on a guideline for clinical trials and hoping that this will make life easier for guys like you also to better plan for the launch in European countries.
Sure.
But, yeah.
And there are areas where, I mean, in Germany, right, with DIGA recently, I mean, there are things that we're learning from you in this country, I think, in terms of, I'm really glad to see that there's a lot happening right now in terms of, and I think that a big part of that will come as more and more of these studies start to implement these decentralized or virtual components. And, the pharmaceutical sponsors, the device companies start to get a level of comfort that, okay, these data are being accepted by regulators. We're able to demonstrate that they are still of high quality, and we're actually able to, do things in a more patient-centric way, and sometimes save some money even. So increasingly, I think that that will be something that we're leaning towards. I actually, just prior to coming to Curebase, I was working for an Italian pharmaceutical company. So I got to know real firsthand, the differences between, EU and Asia Pac and South America. And I think they are vast, but I'm optimistic that in the coming years, these type of approaches will hopefully help us to, get together as a global community and find some commonalities.
Yeah, and maybe Isabel, leaning back and knowing that you have looked at, I don't know how many companies active in that space, looking at, I don't know how many trials and how they're being conducted in those two regions. What would you say? What are the main problems? Those solutions at least claim to solve. What was it? Which problems did you came across in your research?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we know that patient recruitment has long been a problem in clinical research. And there is this number that kind of gets thrown around in this industry that 80% of clinical trials are either delayed or even stopped because they just cannot reach the recruitment numbers that they need. And so having these kinds of digital tools, whether it be real world data for better patient identification or potentially some kind of social media advertising, that can be huge in terms of actually finding the right patients for the clinical trial. But beyond just identification, I think that the burdens that patients have to go through to actually take part in a clinical trial can often be quite high. I mean, especially if they're patients with a chronic disease and they have to be going to some kind of trial site once or twice a week. This is oftentimes causing patients to drop out and not be able to participate in a clinical trial. And so if you can kind of meet the patients where they are with these sorts of digital tools, you can make sure that patients can stay engaged and longer in a trial. And when you look at it from the sponsor's perspective, in terms of course, budgeting for the trial, it costs a lot more money to actually replace a patient that dropped out than it does to recruit a patient. So sponsors and trial sites, they want to keep the patients engaged for as long as possible. And I think that these are some of the key problems. And finally, of course, the efficiency of the data collection. I would say that's also quite huge because in my background, I was working in clinical research before coming to Research to Guidance. And even though, it was a research institution and a university, we always collected patient outcomes on pieces of paper, on clipboards, and then would spend hours transcribing them into a system. And you kind of ask yourself, why couldn't have this been done on an iPad? And so that was always something that was quite surprising to me. I think it's clear that the industry has long needed this digital push, and because of COVID, these kinds of technologies are becoming more popular, and it's quite exciting.
Yeah, would you subscribe to it, Adam?
Yes, absolutely. And I think that, as I mentioned before, as we kind of move into this space where it will continue to gain momentum as there's additional kind of buy-in from all the different stakeholders. But I think one of the things that I've learned a lot, I have a very traditional background as far as, I started as a clinician and got into clinical trials and then got into operations and then got into pharma. And, as part of that journey, recognizing, the pain points that Isabel was mentioning about recruitment and other things, what I'm realizing now as being part of a software company is we don't look at things in the same way when it comes to the user experience, right? Like this UX research that software companies will do to really understand what is the journey of the different users of this platform, be it investigators, be it the research participants themselves, and applying some of those things and even behavioral science to how we set up this experience to say, as Isabel mentioned, right, we often are starting now on the digital recruitment side. Well, that's the initial first impression, right? And that matters so much, but then it also matters what that next step is it sequence? How do they get to, are they being led to a chatbot where they're going to get frustrated and drop off? How do we get them to a person in a seamless way? Building in calendar features where they can easily get to a real person on a time that makes sense for them. And then mapping out that entire participant journey, understanding whether they like email or text or whatever that might be. It's really, it improves, we've found that it improves retention significantly. And as Isabel mentioned, retention is everything.
I mean, yeah, the hype is on. Yeah, not only on digital or virtual trials. Just read about the investment secured by Medable only a few days ago. Yeah, so they secured I think $300 million US.
Yep.
So, what is your impression? I mean, is it now overhyped, and after COVID, things will normalize, and business will become more quiet? I mean, before COVID, there have been some investments, in this market, but nothing compared to the last 2 years. So, where do you see the market will head to in the next 2 years? after the COVID. I mean, let's assume that we will get rid of COVID next year.
Yeah.
So where do you see that? Yeah, is it will we wake up and scrap our eyes and say, oh, maybe we got carried away, and maybe the way clinical trials are being conducted in the future is not always virtual.
I think that there's definitely something to be said for doing certain trials in a traditional way. Mm-hmm. I think that we should see, and there's a lot of great work happening out of global organizations such as the Decentralized Trials and Research Alliance. I know there's IMI, there's the Clinical Trials and Transformation Initiative here that we work closely with to try and define some of these different things, like the term decentralized trials. I think that decentralized trials as defined in the broadest way, meaning that we're just incorporating more aspects that can allow people to do things remotely and giving flexibility to participants, isn't going anywhere. I think that this idea that all trials are going to be virtual in 5 years and the research sites are going to be, as we know them, will be gone, is too far on the other end of the spectrum. And I don't think that's really what we're hearing patients want either. Many times patients want, these options to go to the clinic one day and then the next day have, the blood drawn in their home, perhaps. I think that one thing that, as the hype, blows up, one thing that we have to keep in mind, Ken Getz out of Tufts University here is a thought leader who often, I go to help bring me back down to reality. And, he often reminds us that our clinical trials are already becoming increasingly more complex over the years, right? More endpoints, more data being collected. Now we're layering on more technology and more flexibility. So these are all things that we have to weigh on a study-by-study basis and say, does it make sense for this patient population? Does it make sense? Will it really add value by adding any components? So I think we really need to take a pragmatic approach and not get overhyped, as you're kind of referring to there.
Yeah. Okay. Now, I want to raise your attention also to another topic, another group of companies that shows an interest into digital clinical trials, and I mean digital therapeutic companies. I know that Isabel, in your research, you have spoken to many digital therapeutic companies, and what do you think? What sort of roles will they play in this market from now onwards?
Yeah, absolutely. In terms of digital therapeutics, I would say that there's two main roles that some of these companies will take. And the first and probably the most important one is going to be the role of a sponsor. So as digital therapeutics and digital health in general gains popularity, many of these solutions will need to start either distinguishing themselves from their competitors or potentially gaining approval as a medical device. And for that, they're going to have to do a clinical trial. And so, of course, Adam, you mentioned that, the majority of trials are not going to be completely virtual, and we're not moving to an entirely virtual operating system. But I do think that there's something to be said for a digital therapeutics. That's a great opportunity for an entirely virtual trial because you're already testing something digital. The participants are already using it every day in their home, and that's really a strong use case for a digital trial. So I think that's one of the big roles. And another role which maybe is not quite so popular today, but we have seen in our research could be possible is actually a service provider. And so many of these digital therapeutics companies, they have a lot of patient data that could be used, for example, in patient recruitment, or they have very strong methods of keeping their patients engaged. So this could actually turn into something that is used during a decentralized clinical trial, potentially building the patient-reported outcomes platform off of this existing digital therapeutics platform is another potential market entry strategy for them.
Do you ever come across DTX company as being a competitor yet, Adam?
DTX companies being a competitor? No, actually, we haven't come across that. We're really excited. Personally, I'm very excited. Coming from pharma space a little less than 2 years ago, really not knowing much about digital health and quickly learning that, as Isabel said, this is just this perfect match, right, of therapies being delivered electronically with a platform where we can actually integrate, right? So we can take our platform, which has the things that perhaps the DTX platform doesn't do, like patient-reported outcomes or other things like that, and build integrations so that the data's can really live in a central repository. So we are right now we're running, I believe, 4 or 5 active DTX studies and have done a number of others. And we just love the space. I think that it gives a lot of opportunity, and especially in a pandemic, with things happening around mental health, that we can provide options for people in their home, validated therapies that are really novel. And we're excited to see the space continue to grow.
Adam, I have a question for you actually about these digital therapeutics trials. Do you find that they can truly be 100% virtual, or do you often also partner with a physical site for a digital therapeutics trial?
So it depends on generally on the patient population. For example, we've had some that are in the serious mental health space where folks are quite sick and really in a clinic, in an inpatient setting already. And the digital therapeutic actually aims to solve some of what happens when they leave the clinic. So in a case where they might leave the clinic and have to come back every week for cognitive behavioral therapy, the app might replace some of that by delivering some of that CBT remotely and providing them a platform, a portal for them to interact with clinicians as needed. So I think that in that case, we might see a combination of clinic plus virtual, but there are others that we've done, like in IBS or others, that it's quite easy to identify these participants through digital mechanisms, right? Because the participant population is relatively broad, and the conditions, although they can be quite a big problem, really lend themselves well to not necessarily needing to pull patients into a clinic for all these visits.
Yeah, I like what you said about, the clinic plus the digital solution, because I think it kind of speaks to the larger story of what we're seeing in digital health in general, which is that many of these are just going to be digital companions to help make the patient process more efficient and more comfortable for them. So, for example, in the same way that we don't believe that telemedicine is going to, of course, replace all doctor-patient interactions, I think the same can be said for these decentralized trials. And it's kind of like, to what extent, and it's going to be a highly almost personal process depending on what the trial is actually studying. Yeah.
And maybe, Adam, putting on your pharma hat, if you like to, again, you mentioned that you have a history in pharma, and they are typically the sponsors of the trials. What would you say? What are the main barriers pharma still sees in using virtual or making trials virtual or even hybrid? Yeah. So what stops them from doing it?
So I think the kind of gateway that we're seeing into really working with larger pharma clients right now is post-market phase 4 type studies, right? I think that very early phase studies like phase 1, where oftentimes we need them in clinic, sometimes we find opportunity for aspects of decentralized trials, but fully virtual, certainly not. I think that a lot of the reticence from pharma comes from the fact that these phase 3 studies, these pivotal studies, are years. They are tens of millions of dollars, and can actually make or break a company, right? So until we have a decent amount of a regulatory pathway that's worn enough to where pharma companies can feel confident that, okay, somebody else did it, that's where the challenge is. I think we've always done it a certain way, and there's this fear of failing by doing something new, even if it means, we might fail by doing it the traditional way, but people won't be mad at us because, well, that's the way everybody's always done it, right? So I think that there's the fact that the pandemic forced many pharma companies to either shift this way because of continuity or because they just did not want to wait or delay their trials, will eventually help to give data that we can show, look, regulators have been saying that they support this, and now we have a number of molecules that have been approved because of this. There's just such a long lead time, as you know.
The barriers here you see when looking at your former colleagues, and how would they look at the things you do today? Yeah, and what would they say to you? Yeah, is that, oh, no, that the quality is not good enough. We still have to do all the work manually, recruiting the patients manually. It's not good enough yet to just look at the electronic patients data. So are those points which you would expect to hear from your colleagues still today?
Yeah, so I think that what we're hearing, so as part of groups like the CTTI and DTRA, we work closely with pharma companies to collaborate and build some of these guidance, as well as just colleagues that I have in the past who recognize, even at big pharma companies, right, that this is the way that we want to go. We recognize that FDA is doing it, that other regions are doing it as well in terms of supporting these type of initiatives. But there's still that reticence because there haven't been many, large pivotal trials that have led to approvals, whether in US or outside of US, based on a fully virtual or mostly hybrid model. I think that's going to change in the next couple of years because those studies are happening right now. But there are some pharma companies, even big pharma companies, that are quite innovative and are already leaning heavily into this. And we're in talks with a couple of them, and others in our space are also working with some. So I think smaller pharma companies, where perhaps they have a single molecule, it's tough for them to put all their money, all their chips into that pile. But
sure.
5 years from now, 5 years from now, I'd love to see that there's a lot more, less reticence towards doing this.
Yeah. Okay. So let's see. Maybe we talk again in 5 years from now and see how the landscape evolved. By the way, in our session at the GIANT conference, we will also have somebody from a DTX company, and they conducted a clinical trial completely virtual. Or I must say, they have one hybrid element included, which is a telehealth component. So you can say that's not really a not virtual element here to it. So they conducted from the design to the very end of that study. They conducted everything remotely and supported by digital tools. So it's possible, and we invite this company also to join our session in a few weeks from now. So I think that's a bit of an advertisement for the session, Barry. I hope you permit.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And the other question I would have for Isabel, maybe it's a bit of a promoting for the research you did. Looking at all those different market segments and so on and so forth, I know that you have spent a lot of time in this research, by the way, which is also available on our website, where you looked into the different business models and company types that are currently addressing and targeting this market for making clinical trials more virtual. So maybe that would be also of interest for the audience here to elaborate a bit more what sort of types of players you found there.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, let me first speak a little bit about this report and this research that we are mentioning. So Research to Guidance has recently published a market report on what we have called the digital decentralized clinical trial landscape. And we have projections for the trends and the figures and how it's going to look between now and 2021 through 2026. And so, of course, we've done the quantitative analysis to understand what is the revenue that's going to be made, what is the size of the market, how many of these trials can we actually expect are going to be conducted with at least some kind of virtual element. But what I would say is quite special about this report, and which what Ralf is alluding to as well, is that we have also qualitatively described the market. And that means that we have looked at who we believe are the top 50 solution providers, and we've tried to understand what are the groups of service offerings, what are these different companies like doing to provide solutions for decentralized clinical trials, and what are the different business models. And in this research, we essentially came up with 6 different archetypes, which is what we've called these different types of service offerings. And so we see everything from the very niche players. For example, we've called them the patient engagement specialists. These are like the software providers that are essentially selling the software and the platform to keep the patients engaged for as long as possible in the clinical trial. We see real world data providers that are focusing on patient recruitment and doing initial feasibility checks to say, okay, which is the best physical site to set up? Like which site would have the most patients around it open to participate? And then we also see, for example, service providers that are focusing entirely on logistics. So how can we actually ship the medication instead of to the trial site individually to each patient's home? And then finally, we have the end-to-end providers, which is where we have actually put Curebase in, who are those that are focusing on providing services across the clinical value chain. And I think what's most interesting is we now see these contract research organizations. So these are the large market incumbents that have been providing clinical trial activities. They're kind of last minute scrambling to also get a piece of this decentralized clinical trial market. Since COVID, it's been something that the sponsors are asking for. And so the result of this is that even though it's a very segmented market, there's a lot of interaction between different players. So we see the CROs trying to buy up potentially software providers, and we see different niche service providers partnering together so that they can have a larger service offering. And then we see kinds of interactions as well with the end-to-end service providers trying to improve their service offering. So there's a lot of movement in this market. It's very dynamic and it's very interesting. And it's something that any of the listeners can learn a bit more about by reading our report.
And what surprised you most?
I think what surprised me the most is the fact that these digital tools are not yet so common as maybe we would think they are. And even though, I guess in my personal experience, I've seen that firsthand, that we never really use digital tools in clinical trials, I would have expected that by now it would be much more common. And so I think that hopefully with this push of COVID-19 and with these new services provided by these kinds of companies, we will see that clinical trials are going to be more efficient. Because even though there is hesitance, as there always is in healthcare, to innovate and digitalize, there's really a lot that can be offered in terms of on the patient side and making it easier for the patients to participate in clinical trials. Mm-hmm. So that's what we would expect.
Yeah, thank you, Isabel. And Adam, what would surprise you the next 5 years the most? What must happen that would really surprise you, or isn't there any surprise you would expect from this market?
Yeah, I honestly would be very surprised if, kind of harking back to something you had mentioned a little earlier, Ralf, if we actually, the pandemic ends and we find ourselves pushed back into a situation where we're like, oh, we really don't, it was working fine before, let's not use so much of this technology. I would be surprised.
Okay, so
I think.
Go ahead.
That on the other end of the spectrum, I would be very surprised if it just became the norm overnight, too, right? I think that there's some sort of balance there that we're going to have to strike. We need to have the sites included as part of this discussion, and we need to be able to put some of the control on and support them in doing that.
Yeah. Okay. So maybe in 5 years from now, we meet again, and then we talk about those anecdotes from clinical trials where the consent was still done by paper. For example. So let's let's organize something in 5 years from now. Yeah, Barry, is that okay?
I think it's a very good idea. I'm making a note in the calendar right now.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so thanks from my side, yeah, to Adam and Isabel, having this really, I think, very interesting discussion. Thanks a lot. I'm really looking forward for the session at the Giant Health on the 30th. And Barry, I think you will also, I mean, you will be around. I'm not sure
Yes.
about the session, but you will be around, right?
Yes, of course. So, thank you, Ralf. I have found this to be an incredibly interesting conversation, and Isabel and Adam, thank you for your valuable contribution. It's a fascinating world which is evolving rapidly, and yet, as you identified, Adam, there's a lot of, if you will, traditional activities that are being challenged, and a lot of uncertainty regarding how much of these activities can be made virtual or can be done digitally. And also, Isabel, the report that you guys made reference to sounds extremely interesting. So, for all of our listeners, have a look in the comment section of this video, and you'll be able to see links to R2G, and of course, links specifically to the important and impressive report that Isabel has been working on and that she made reference to in this conversation. Um, Ralf, I think we'll wrap up now if that's okay with you guys. This has been an unbelievably valuable and informative conversation. So I've learned a lot, and it's such an interesting and important topic. And I guess, as all of you have highlighted, the pandemic obviously has been a terrible tragedy and crisis for humanity. And yet, at the same time, this has provided interesting and useful impetus for us to evaluate our processes and procedures and to look at digital mechanisms, and not merely simple things like telemedicine, but very profound things like the way that trials are conducted. And I hope that as a result, there's a silver lining to the pandemic, and that as a result, for example, the theme of decentralized clinical trials is going to move forward more successfully than perhaps it was in terms of its trajectory 2 or 3 years from now. So that's reasons to be cheerful. So, Ralf, thank you. And Adam, thank you. Isabel, thank you very much. Really appreciate your time. Thank you to all of our listeners from around the world, obviously. We hope that you find these weekly TV episodes interesting. We invite you to like this YouTube video, to subscribe to our channel. Our goal is to grow our community around the world to serve everybody whose business is healthcare and technology and innovation. Once again, my name is Barry Shrier, and I'm the founder of GIANT Health. We're very proud to have a valuable partnership with Ralf and Research to Guidance, also known as R2G. They're actually leading the Digital Therapeutics Conference at the GIANT Health event. Again, that's on the 30th of November this year. You can learn more about it from our website, www.giant.health. We invite everybody to come to London and meet us in person, or you can participate in Ralf and the R2G DTX conference at Giant. Everybody can participate in it virtually. So it's available to get involved in remotely. Loads of extremely interesting and valuable content, great networking opportunities. So we look forward to seeing everybody there. Thank you very much for your time, and hope to see you at our episode next week. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Barry.
everyone.
Thank you, Adam.